Welcome, everyone. Today we have with us author Matt Ridley, one of my favorite authors of lots of books that I currently, even my son is reading. My 9-year-old son is reading Rational Optimist right now and is really enjoying it. So
fantastic.
I'm excited about that.
I hope it cheers him up.
Yes, exactly. But today he's joining us to talk about his latest book, Viral: The Search for the Origins of COVID-19. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Not at all, Carlos. Great to be with you again. Nice to see you.
So let me start directly. Why write this book?
Well, I think there's no more important topic than where this pandemic came from at the moment. It's devastating. It's done huge damage. We need to know how it started so we know to make sure it doesn't happen again. And yet I'm seeing all around the world from early 2020 onwards, a surprising lack of interest in asking and answering this question. Where did it come from? The scientific establishment doesn't seem to be very interested, and they told us very early in the pandemic we could rule out the laboratory origin. It was bound to have come through the market. That seemed a little premature when we looked at the evidence. The journalistic mainstream didn't seem terribly interested. Everybody seemed to be sort of accepting that the Chinese authorities would solve the problem and we'd be okay. Well, I don't think that's good enough. 2 years in, most pandemics, we'd have solved it long ago by now, particularly given modern technology. 2 years in, the trail hasn't gone cold, but a lot of people are acting as if it has, as if there's no more to say, that we may never know, that kind of thing. That's just not good enough. So I was very keen on understanding what was known, what was not known, and I was taking at face value what the scientists were telling me in the early few weeks. I now find they were saying something completely different behind my back, which I find really annoying. And at a certain point, I came across a scientist who was more open-minded and who was saying, actually, some of the evidence does seem to point towards a laboratory. So it's an open question. It's probably the market, but it might not be. We need to investigate. Her name was Alina Chan. She was writing some really interesting stuff, making some very interesting analyses of the genome of the virus. And so I eventually suggested we team up and write a book together. And in relatively short time, we did. I did the first draft, she rewrote it, I rewrote her rewrites, she rewrote my rewrites. We did all this within about 8 months, which was fast going and great fun. Well, not great fun, it's a horrible topic.
It's a horrible story, right?
Millions of people are dead, but very, very engrossing as a subject.
So it's a pretty fantastic effort on your end here, because the book is incredibly detailed on lots of aspects of even background that you had to put together to understand potential sources of a new pandemic, for example. So I mean, I'm amazed you were able to do that in 8 months. That's really, really congratulations, I suppose.
Well, it was a steep learning curve on some aspects of virology. I mean, luckily, I've written several previous books on genomics, so I do understand genes, genetics, DNA, RNA, things like that. But it was still a very steep learning curve for me, some of the virology. The biology of bats, things like that is important. What pangolins are, all that kind of stuff, which comes a bit more naturally to me as an evolutionary biologist. But it was, Alina is right at the forefront of this field. She's at the Broad Institute, which is the leading genomics institute in the world. And she works on viral vector engineering, so she's right in this field.
So just let's line out the two hypotheses here. So the main issue is whether we can establish with some sort of confidence whether this was a zoonotic, is that the right word? I guess I'm using the right word. Escape, which means that somehow a virus that exists in some animal is able to then jump into humans and become able to infect from humans to humans. That's there's lots of, and we can talk a little bit about history of different viruses that have been able to make that jump and how we figure those things out. And the other hypothesis is whether this came out from a lab, somehow was not a zoonotic jump, but rather it came from a lab leak. And just to be clear, when we say lab leak, that does not imply necessarily an engineered lab leak, something that was, a virus that was engineered in the lab, but rather something that might have been studied in a lab, natural virus that might have been studied in a lab that somehow made its way out of a lab. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, I think a good way to think about it is to start with what we do know and then what we don't know. So what we do know is that this is a bat virus. It's a virus normally found in bats. And that's true of all SARS-like coronaviruses. And it's not just any bat, horseshoe bats. They don't live in North America, by the way, or South America. So you're okay over there. You know, you're not going to get one of these pandemics in the Americas, in passing, that is. So we know it started in bats. We also know that the bats that carry these viruses are mostly in southern China. And this was discovered by the scientist at the center of this controversy, Dr. Shizheng Li, over the last 10, 15 years since the SARS epidemic. They're in Yunnan province and Guangdong province. They're way down in the south of China, and also in Southeast Asia. They're not found in central China. But now that's interesting because this disease broke out in central China. It broke out in Wuhan, a city with no obvious connection to these kinds of viruses. Indeed, a city where there's been quite a lot of surveying of bats in the region around there, and very few of them have coronaviruses, let alone SARS-like coronaviruses.
How far? So everybody knows, how far is that province from Wuhan?
Well, the key site in Yunnan, where they found the closest relative, is 1,885 kilometers by road from Wuhan. That's New York to Orlando, to put it in perspective. It's a long way.
Bats don't fly. Bats don't fly those.
Bats don't fly those distances. Bats don't migrate like birds. You know, birds go huge distances when they migrate. Bats do local migrations, but nothing like that. They tend to live locally. Did it start in Wuhan? Yes. That's the other thing we know. So we know it's a bat virus, but we know it started in Wuhan. How do we know that? Well, all the early cases were in Wuhan. We've not been able to find a single exception. All the cases in Wuhan converge on one or at most two different ancestral virus genomes. So there's vanishingly little doubt that it began in Wuhan, but it came from a bat a long way away. So the central question we have to answer is, how did a bat virus travel at least 1,000 miles to the other place? Now, there are really four ways it could have happened. Two of them we'd call natural, and two of them we'd call research related. So the first way is, back in Yunnan, somebody's farming an animal that is susceptible to this kind of virus near a bat cave. The bat droppings land in the animal's cage. The animal gets infected. The animal is then shipped to a market. It's eaten by people, and in that process, people get infected. That's what's happened in SARS. That's what happened in 2002-3 in the case of SARS. The animal that carried it was mainly the palm civet, and they were able to establish this very quickly. First of all, by spotting that the early cases were all food handlers, chefs, things like that. And secondly, that the food they were handling was palm civets, and that the palm civets were infected. So, and it was a 99% similar virus. The other three ways it could happen is that it could be a person who carries it all the way from Yunnan to Wuhan. Let's say a villager who farms near the bat cave, goes into the bat cave one day to collect some guano to spread on his fields or something. People do that, gets infected, catches a train to Wuhan to visit his family, falls sick, gives it to them, that kind of thing. The third way is that person who travels from Wuhan might have been a scientist, because one thing we do know is that scientists were going into caves in Yunnan to look for bats and look for viruses in bats on quite a significant scale over the last 10 years. And the fourth way could have been that it traveled as a sample brought back by those scientists to be examined and experimented on in the laboratory. And that's where things get interesting, because we know that exactly that was happening. Well over 100 SARS-like coronaviruses of different ones were brought from Yunnan to Wuhan to be studied, because Wuhan was the site of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is the leading institute in the world for studying SARS-like coronaviruses. Not in China, not in Hubei province, in the world, right? Now, I mean, Chapel Hill, North Carolina will run it a close second because they do experiments on these kinds of viruses, and one or two other places, including in Shanghai and so on. But Wuhan is, if you'd said in 2019, I want to go and study SARS-like coronaviruses, the first advice you'd have got would be go to Wuhan. That's where the bulk of the papers on this are published. That's where the most of the viruses have been put into genomes, databases, and so on. So it is prima facie quite interesting that this, let me give you a little parallel here. In Britain in 2007, there was an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in cattle. It happened 13 miles from the world's leading reference laboratory for foot and mouth virus studies, right, at a place called Pirbright in Surrey. That wasn't a coincidence. There was a leaking pipe at the lab, and a contractor was called in to mend the pipe, and he went straight from there to a farm, and he infected the farm. It turned out, that was what came alive. This is pretty similar, frankly. A SARS-like disease breaks out in very close to the laboratory that is the world's leading SARS-like disease studying laboratory. But we need to prove that. We can't just, we need to find the leaking pipe and the contractor, if you like. And that's what our book is all about, is trying to piece together the evidence for that idea, and also for the alternative idea that it might have been a market event like SARS. But the problem with that is that quite early on, the evidence was pointing away from the market. They tested all the animals in the market, found none that were positive. They found some virus in the market, but it was on countertops and in the sewage and things like that. It was from people, not from animals. They tested 80,000 animals all across China in the wild, on farms, in the wildlife trade, everything. They still haven't found this virus or a 99% cousin of it in any animal at all. They're finding it now because people give it to mink and cats and things like that. But from the start of the pandemic, no.
So the facts that we know, as you pointed out, is that it's a virus that came from a certain area of China, a southern province of China, where there's lots of these horseshoe bats that carry lots of different kinds of SARS-like viruses, of which we've been studying throughout the last 20 years. A lot of study being done on that, on those particular viruses from with samples being collected there and sent to the premier laboratory in Wuhan, the Wuhan Virology Institute. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. We also know that the virus. Well, we know for a fact that we have not been able to find any trace of the virus in any animal in the market, where at first the hypothesis was somehow somebody contracted by eating something from the market. That's rule out that we haven't found any animals that was sampled around the time and subsequently. And then you mentioned no animal that could have been the link, right? So the idea here is that there's this sort of intermediate host between the bat.
Yeah.
That the bat doesn't come and bite you, and people don't typically eat bats. So you have to have some sort of like intermediate host for that to take place. And we haven't been able to find that. There was a trail of the pangolin. Turns out to be a trail full of problems early on. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I got really involved in this, was because of the pangolin story falling apart. February 7th, 2020, press conference in Guangdong University in China saying, we found this virus in pangolins. It's 99% the same. Problem solved, case over, all good. 3 weeks later, 4 papers come out, published in prestige journals in the West from Chinese groups saying, here are the pangolin viruses. We've analyzed them. Here's their genomes. Here's what they tell us. Drill down into the papers, go through the repetition of the same samples with different names and things like that, and you find they're talking about 3 pangolins, all of which were part of a shipment that was of smuggled pangolins that was intercepted in March 2019, all of which were in Guangdong province in the far south of China. This is nowhere near Wuhan. And all of which are 90% the same, not 99% the same. Well, that's not good enough. That's not the same virus. That's decades different, evolutionarily speaking. So the pangolin story fell apart pretty quickly. And one of the reasons it fell apart is that my co-author, Alina Chan, looked into the data behind the papers, found it was inadequately reported in all sorts of ways, frankly, disgraceful ways. And two of the papers have now had corrections printed in the journals saying, I'm sorry, these papers were all wrong. So it really was a pretty shocking episode of bad science, the pangolin story. But it did its job. It put Western journalists off for a few months, and everyone said, oh, I gather it's the pangolins, et cetera, et cetera. There were no pangolins for sale in the Wuhan market. We know that actually, because by chance, we later found out that somebody had been studying the wildlife that was for sale in the Wuhan market in 2019, and it didn't include pangolins. It included a number of other species, which the Chinese seem to have missed when they tested the animals in the market. So that's intriguing, and we need to look into that. But it didn't include pangolins. It certainly didn't include bats.
So let's speculate for a second. Is this a case of just people trying to jump on a bandwagon to get some papers through and gather some temporary fame and hopefully nobody catches it, or there's any potential sign of nefarious interference here?
Well, what you have to understand is that as soon as the pandemic broke out in Wuhan, a major general who is also a virologist in the Chinese People's Liberation Army was put in charge of that institute. And she cracked down very hard. And so did others in the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And basically no scientist was allowed to publish anything without state permission from then onwards. It looks to us like there was specific direction. You won't publish this, but you will publish that, if you like. And it looks like there was a coordinated attempt to get the pangolin story into the published domain in February of 2020. We can't say that for sure, but it certainly looks that way. That's not necessarily nefarious. What they're saying is, oh, good, we've solved the problem and it doesn't implicate our lab. Let's make the most of this. Let's get it out quickly. Let's ask several teams to go to work on this.
As motivated reasoning, right? Like, oh, find something that I like the story.
Exactly. Let's
go with that, and let's forget about any other thing that could embarrass us, could create some sort of crisis. Exactly. So let me ask you a question that I have a hard time understanding the details of it in the book. Even there's a lot of details in the book about virology in particular. And again, I'm a statistician,
I'm afraid
so
there are passages that get quite hard to follow.
Exactly right. But I think the key question that I have on that is that we know that in 2012 there were some workers in the mines, copper mines in the Hunan province that fell ill with SARS-like infections, viral pneumonia, and which later viruses from the tissues from their lungs got identified as something very, very close to what we have now in COVID-19. So we know that. And that was a big span of time. Now, those six miners, right?
Mm-hmm. Three of them died. Three of them survived.
Three of them died. The three older one died, right? The three younger one survived. Again, something that rings a bell relative to what we see in COVID-19. They got treated in hospitals without any particular special precaution. Somehow that virus was not capable of escaping and infecting other people around them. They got in touch with people. It's just that there was no transmission there. So somehow the virus they were able to contract in a mine, most likely because of a intense exposure of guano. I don't quite remember, but like particles probably, right, going through their nose. They're breathing that for a long time, and that's how that particular infection was able to take place. And there was no subsequent transmission outside of that. So what I'm asking here is that these viruses live in mammals like bats, for example, and some of them are able to infect humans, but not in a very easy way. There's a chapter
Correct.
You described the fact that spillovers are quite rare. There's a lot of studies of how these spillovers from an animal to a human, they're different biology, they're different cell types, they're different spike proteins that you need to have in order to attach to a human cell, right? So viruses are not necessarily well adapted to infect humans. So they are able to, but not with high probability. That's how I read that evidence from those workers that then. And somehow we go from that virus that was not particularly able to infect humans very easily to a virus that is incredibly adapted to infect humans. The human to human, I mean, what we see now in Omicron is just like bravo Omicron, right? We came up with a very nice vaccine, and you came around and just obliterated our ability to stop you from transmitting. How do we go from one to the other?
Yeah, well, to be clear, we don't necessarily need to go from one to the other. We don't know for sure that the viruses they collected from bats following that they collected from people, we don't know what those people died of. Okay. In fact, just in the last day, Dr. Xi Zhengli has given an interview saying they didn't die of virus, they died of fungus. Now, that contradicts what she and a number of other virologists said at the time, and we have the evidence for that. There's a medical thesis from Kunming University Hospital at the time, which says that everybody agrees this is almost certainly a viral disease. And the Institute of Virology, the key is in the name, Xi Zhengli and her colleagues go to the cave where these guys got infected, the mine shaft, and on at least 7 occasions that we know of over the next 2 years, they visit that site in order to sample the bats to try and find a virus, because this looks like the first ever case of a SARS-like virus caught directly from a bat by a human being, of a SARS-like virus that was capable of infecting a human being, albeit not very infectiously, as you point out, because nobody else got sick. So, and the viruses they found in the bats, 9 of them ended up in their freezer and were studied and sequenced in up to 2018, 2019, and were turned out to be the closest relative of SARS-CoV-2 when the pandemic broke out. The closest relative of this virus was in their own freezer. That's quite interesting, right? But you're right to point out that the bat virus they brought back from that mine shaft is not capable of causing a pandemic. For one particular reason above all others, it lacks a thing called a furin cleavage site, which is a little stretch of RNA, that's its equivalent DNA, which enables it to reshape its proteins, makes it much more infectious. And the fact that SARS-CoV-2 has got this thing is the reason we're having a pandemic. Now, it's a very rare thing to find a virus with one of these. We've never found a SARS-like virus with one before. Never. And we still haven't. We still haven't. Okay. They've found other quite close relatives of SARS-CoV-2 in Laos, and they don't have the furin cleavage site in. So it's odder and odder. The more viruses like this that we find in bats that don't have a furin cleavage site in, the more weird it looks that this one does. And here's one of the suspicious things about that. Starting in about 2007, scientists put furin cleavage sites deliberately into viruses to make them easier to grow in the laboratory. And they did that initially with pseudoviruses or single virus genes rather than whole viruses, but then they did it with whole viruses too, not just coronaviruses, but other kinds of virus. And just in 2018, a team at the Wuhan Institute of Virology did exactly such an experiment with a relation of MERS, with a virus related to the MERS disease.
That's the one that came from camels.
That's right. The one that came from camels in the Middle East, right. Exactly. So the habit of putting furin cleavage sites into wild viruses to make them easier to grow in the lab was quite common, and it was used at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, among other places. What's more, the Wuhan Institute of Virology's US partners, the EcoHealth Alliance, put in a proposal to DARPA, part of the Pentagon, for funding to do exactly that experiment on a SARS-like virus. And they were this was in 2018. They were turned down. They were not given permission to do that. Not given the funding to do that experiment by the American government, but they might have got it from the Chinese government. So we do know, as Alina puts it, right, finding a furin cleavage site in a SARS-like virus is like finding a horn on a horse. It's like finding a unicorn, okay? It's a very rare thing to find. We know they were planning to put horns on horses in Wuhan. We know they were capable of putting horns on horses. A horse with a horn on has turned up in what?
Exactly, it shows up in Wuhan.
Shows up in Wuhan. And we're supposed to say, well, that's just a coincidence. It may be, coincidences do happen. But at the very least, it's reasonable to ask the questions, could we look at every experiment you did over the last few years in the Wuhan Institute of Virology on the viruses you haven't published yet, because you've published no genome sequences since 2016, but you've been collecting a lot. Could we have a look at that, please? And that's where we're hitting a brick wall. The answer is no, we can't. Why not?
So it's not just, and I like to highlight, it's not just that coincidence could happen. You're giving me a lot of like really rare situations that, well, yeah, there's the horn on the unicorn, on the horse, and we found a unicorn in the streets. That there's the trail is pretty strong here, but could happen, could be a coincidence. You're right. However, the evidence on the alternative hypothesis here we don't keep finding anything on the other potential hypothesis, which is the zoonotic jump.
Exactly.
Which, by the way, in other situations you have found, you describe a lot of situations in which there was such event, and we were able to trace it back. We were able to find the intermediate host. We were able to get to the trail that led from one certain animal, sometimes through some hosts, into humans, right? And we have not been able to find that at all. That particular updating on the probability of that hypothesis. I'm a Bayesian by training, so I start with a prior after you start reading the book that, well, there's something here that maybe my probability is a little bit higher in the Wuhan hypothesis, but the lab leak hypothesis, but I'm not sure because, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty. And then you start telling me part of the stories and like, my probability is growing over here, my posteriors now. But the one on the zoonotic one doesn't get any update.
That's right. There is no evidence for a zoonotic spillover of a natural kind in a market at the moment. Remember, in the case of SARS, it was 3 months before basically the problem was solved. They found out who was getting it, which animal they were getting it from, and where they were getting it in the markets. Sure, they didn't know where the virus had originated yet, that is to say, but they did a survey within about 5 months and found the similar viruses in bats. So by then they were looking for bats with it in. So well within a year, you know that it's a bat giving it to a palm civet, giving it to people, okay? In the case of MERS, they found somebody died of this horrible disease in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. It was a few months before they figured out that camel handlers were catching this disease more than other people. They tested camels, they found the virus in camels. They figure it's probably a bat virus because a lot of these coronaviruses its relatives have been found in bats. They haven't quite figured out which bat it came from to get into the camels yet, but that's in the case of a nasty disease called Nipah, which broke out in the early 2000s in Malaysia, NIPAH, it's spelled, don't know how you pronounce it, but not a coronavirus, but a lethal disease that killed a few people. They figured out that pigs were giving it to people, and they quite quickly found that pigs were eating mangoes that had been dropped into their cages by fruit bats, and it was originating in the bats. Case solved. Here we are in 2020, which is when we first started looking into this,
right.
By far better technology than they had in those cases. Way superior, faster, more accurate ways of testing for DNA and RNA in the environment, in animals, for sequencing in seconds. I mean, it took a month and a half to sequence the SARS genome in 2003. That was spectacularly fast. Everyone was really impressed. Today, you do it in 2 days. Okay, to get a first genome of SARS-CoV-2. So we've got much better technology. So we should have found the evidence, if there was some, long ago, back in early 2020. And here we are in 2022, and there's still no evidence of any infected animal. Now, it could be that there is some reluctance to blame the market in the Chinese authorities too, for one reason that's quite intriguing, which is that just 2 years before the pandemic broke out, President Xi Jinping had persuaded his friend, Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, that the WHO would recognize traditional Chinese medicine as a legitimate form of medical care. He's a very strong champion of this traditional Chinese medicine. Now, traditional Chinese medicine has some things in it that work and a lot of things that don't, because it's not based on experimental evidence. So, for example, eating pangolin scales will do wonders for your fertility. Exactly, it's fingernails. Right. I mean, it's the same stuff as fingernails. Might as well chew your fingernails. You can sort of see in some of the pronouncements coming out of the Chinese authorities a reluctance to blame the market as well, which is why they came up with this wacky theory that it reached Wuhan on frozen food from abroad. Two problems with this theory. One is no evidence for it. Generally, we like to find evidence for a theory. And two, it's highly implausible when you think it through. Why would it only infect people at the end of the frozen food chain and not at the beginning or along the way or in other cities or anything like that? So, and then one of the Chinese government spokesmen then decided to blame an American lab leak. He said it probably came out of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. They do this kind of work. Oh, so you do think it was a lab leak? You just think it was an American lab leak?
Exactly. So right now, I mean, a year ago, or maybe a little bit more than a year ago, you asking those questions, you're talking about this, put you in a category of conspiracy theorists without, like crazy people, right? But that's not quite the situation right now. I think right now the scientific community even came around a little bit, and at least are willing to be agnostic about it. Like, well, we don't know. I don't think perhaps our conversation here is leading to folks listening to it think that we are more on the side that it seems that the probability seems higher on the leak hypothesis, but we don't know. We're upfront in saying that we don't know. Maybe it's a little higher the probability, but that doesn't mean there's no uncertainty. And I think the scientific community is at least getting to the point where, well, maybe it's even odds right now. We don't know quite. Is that a fair assessment of where we are currently?
Yes and no. That's the way it looked back in the summer of last year, after a series of joint letters went to Science magazine and a number of other publications around the world saying we need to take both hypotheses seriously. The World Health Organization investigation was a farce. We need to do better. And so, yes, suddenly the media woke up and stopped censoring any discussion of the laboratory leak. Facebook had literally censored it up until that point. Wikipedia was completely intolerant of any discussion of this stuff. Jamie Metzel, who's a advisor to the World Health Organization and an author of books about this kind of topic, he recounts how he wrote to his good friend and my good friend David Quammen, who's written about biological spillovers before, and said, look, don't you think the evidence is starting to suggest that we need to look at this? And the reply from David Quammen was, how many people were on the grassy knoll and killed JFK? So in other words, do you realize you're a complete wacko for embracing this theory? Now, on the whole, we're not there anymore. On the whole, you are allowed to talk about it. But there is a very strong pushback still from within the scientific community who do not want this to turn out to be the explanation. they are sounding, by the way, like extreme libertarians. They're saying, look, trust us. We know what we're doing. We don't need regulation. Our labs are quite safe. Don't tell us what experiments we can and can't do. It's interesting for me to be on the other side of that argument.
Right.
Likewise, of course, the Chinese government has a vested interest. Most businessmen and most politicians are more interested in renormalizing relations with China or something than they are with pursuing this issue. So it's a relatively small number of us who are keeping the flame of this investigation alive. As I say, the World Health Organization has dropped the ball, frankly, by holding a farcical press conference, I think 2 years ago today, funnily enough, in Wuhan. No, 1 year ago today, which they basically endorsed the frozen food theory and ruled out the laboratory leak theory, because that's what their Chinese colleagues had insisted on them doing. So it's not given that we will have a proper debate and a proper investigation. As far as we can see, the intelligence agencies in the US had a quick look at it for Biden and then haven't done anything since. And when I challenge this, some of my journalistic colleagues say, well, you don't expect them to give a running commentary. No, but it'd be nice if they said something every now and then or discovered something. So it's not at all impossible that the water will close over the head of this pandemic without us having a good explanation. And for me, that's simply outrageous. I mean, for a start, it's not very helpful for preventing the next pandemic, but even just morally, it's just not right for the people who've died not to find out why this happened.
So that brings me to a question I have, and that's maybe moving a little away from the trail here of the investigation, but it's the sort of social aspect of how the interaction between society and quote science have taken place in the past 2 years. I don't know. You have more experience on the science world. I mean, you've been around. You've been editor for the science part of the Economist for a while. This notion that it's something that a hypothesis comes out and immediately there is a dichotomy between the experts and nobody else can say anything about it. It seemed that it was very clear in 2020 that if you question, for example, that I don't think this is going to kill as many people as Neil Ferguson is doing, you were deemed just a Trump supporter, whatever, backward looking. And doesn't matter the evidence coming in and showing that those predictions were all completely out of whack. They don't have to justify that. And it was a series of those things. There was the severity and the speed in which it's going to spread, it was wrong. Whether or not we should wear masks or not was wrong. Well, let alone the fact that the evidence for that doesn't seem to add up. But still, we don't. Once there's a decision that that's what the experts, the court, or at least the elite opinion is, or whatever, it's impossible to move away from it. Do you have any sense of why that is the case? Because that seems to be another one of those instances where, no, we, for whatever reason, which I don't quite understand why the elites in the West would be so pro-China on this and completely ignore the possibility of something coming out, but so be it. I mean, maybe that's a very good work by the Chinese spy community. I don't know. Back in the day, we'd blame the KGB. They're pretty good. The KGB did it, right? But now we don't do that. So is that social dynamic somehow? I mean, it's exhausting to live through it, because even at universities where I live, that seems to be that we don't care anymore about actually asking questions and being skeptics and trying to investigate things. This swings back and forth between the current truth.
There's a wonderful video clip which I strongly recommend looking up of Richard Feynman, the great Nobel Prize-winning physicist, giving a lecture, and he says, "So how does science work? Well, first of all, we guess," and everybody laughs. And he says, "No, don't laugh. We guess what the answer is. We then look for evidence that supports or doesn't support that guess, and we then decide whether the guess was right or wrong. Okay, and it doesn't matter how many letters after his name the man who made the guess was. It doesn't matter how clever he is, what institution he is. If the evidence says the guess was wrong, then it's wrong. That's science. That's the definition of science. The evidence always wins, not the theory, right? And for me, this is what's been going wrong recently, is that we have allowed people to argue from authority, to say, look, believe me, because I've won the Nobel Prize, or I'm the professor, or whatever, I know what I'm talking about, I'm right. He might be right. He often is on some subjects, but it's the evidence that makes him right, not his degree, okay? And that's a very important point. So science has been behaving much more like a priesthood than it should in recent years on a number of issues. And you see this in the way that it manufactures a consensus, right? A scientific consensus. This is the answer, and everything else is heresy or blasphemy or wrong. Now, it's always done this to some extent. Look at the way, Alfred Wegener suggested continental drift. They told him, don't be stupid, you're an idiot. Charles Darwin suggested natural selection. Or, much more recently, right up until the 1970s, eating fat causes heart disease. That was an enforced consensus by one very evangelical scientist and his allies, and it turned out to be wrong. And it took us very, very long time to undo that. Most people still haven't heard that that's wrong, as it were. So why does this happen? Well, in my view, the vital feature of science that keeps it honest, that prevents confirmation bias, ruining it, and professors just looking for evidence that supports their pet theory and not looking for evidence that disconfirms it. The vital ingredient is the decentralized nature of science. It's in universities all over the country. And Professor A puts up a theory and goes out and finds some evidence that's consistent with it and says, look, I'm right. And Professor B says, don't be so stupid. Of course you're not right. I've found some other evidence which shows you're wrong. You're an idiot, blah, blah, blah. And they have a row. And eventually we decide which has the stronger evidence. But when Professor A and Professor B both sign a document saying this is the consensus, whether it's on how much climate change there's going to be, or whether fat causes heart disease, or whether how bad COVID's going to be, or whether it came out of a laboratory, when they sign up to a consensus, it's no longer behaving like science. It's behaving like a good old-fashioned religious institution. For me, science has become a huge institution with a lot of very centralized funding, which enforces consensuses on it. And you see this very clearly in the case of this problem of where the virus came from, because in early February 2020, the main funders of virology research, Dr. Anthony Fauci in the US and Dr. Jeremy Farrar in the UK, were on a phone call discussing the possibility, they thought it might even be a probability, that it had come out of a laboratory. But within days, they're sending a message to all the other scientists, this is nonsense, it's ruled out, we go the other way. And please write articles saying that. Go out there and shut this off. Shut down that hypothesis. That's the words that Francis Collins, Fauci's boss, in effect, used. Just think of the signal that sends if you're in a virology lab and you're a mid-level scientist. I'm going to be asking these guys for a grant to keep my job, to enable me to advance my career. I'd better stick to this consensus because these guys have this huge funding power over me. It doesn't have to be a quid pro quo. It doesn't have to be because you've been a good boy and stuck to the consensus, we're going to give you a bigger grant. It just has to be, it doesn't have to be that explicit. So
it's a soft pressure, right?
What science needs is red teams. We're not getting red teams. We're not getting well-funded opposition to the conventional wisdom, and that's what we should be getting.
And that's true not only in the hard sciences. I think that's true in social science a lot, and a lot of places where certain opinions, certain ideas, certain hypotheses are just not entertained these days, and universities have to do better.
Yeah.
So,
As they say, what's the opposite of diversity? University.
University, exactly. let me give you a chance to I think you use a quote from Casablanca in the book. Do you remember?
I do. Rick, the owner of the Rick's bar in Casablanca, Humphrey Bogart, says of Ilsa, Ingrid Bergman, of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she has to walk into mine.
That's absolutely brilliant.
Of all the cities in the world for a coronavirus outbreak to happen, Wuhan is pretty unsurprising.
That's right. That's right. Matt, thanks for joining us. Thanks for writing the book. Thanks for being on this trail. This is God's work.
Thank you, Carlos. It's really enjoyable talking to you. I hope we'll see you soon in person, because it's great that we can think about traveling again.
We'll do. All right.